Hey guys, welcome back to the Inflammation Nation. We are on what is probably the next to last episode of this mini series on labs that I would or would not spend my own money on. And today we're going to be talking about GI testing or stool testing specifically. And I say it that way because there are a lot of different tests that relate to different aspects of function of the gut. And stool testing is just simply one of those. And I know that we've talked about the GI system in bits and pieces throughout some of the episodes that we've done leading up to this point. And what I want to do is I just want to go over a couple of the fundamentals, talk a little bit about the main influences over gut health and gut function. And then we'll start working our way towards talking about stool testing, why it might be important, and so on. And so you might remember in past episodes, we talked about things like the brain-gut axis, and how the brain has significant influence over things like, for example, gut motility, enzyme secretion, blood flow to the gut tissues as well, and the control of the muscular aspect of your intestinal system. And that causes propulsion, so being able to move food along the tube to the exit point, and also the control of the muscular sphincters, these circular muscles that are placed in different spots around the intestinal system to keep it compartmentalized. So, for example, to keep the upper part, your esophagus, separate from your stomach, to keep your stomach separate from your small intestine, and to keep your small intestine separate from your large intestine and your colon. And as long as you have a healthy brain and that communication process is working well, then we tend to have better gut function. And even though the gut has its own internal neurological system called the enteric nervous system, we know that if we sever or interfere with the connection between the brain and the gut, then the gut doesn't function as well as if the brain is intact. And so we see a lot of gut issues related to situations where we might have traumatic brain injury or concussion. We see it in states of neurodegeneration, and we see it in states of neurodevelopmental delay. But the brain-gut axis is, even though it is a significant contributor to gut health and gut functionality, it's not the only thing. We also have influences from the thyroid system. And more importantly, well, perhaps not more importantly, equally as important, we have influences that come from the internal gut environment itself, like what's going on inside the gut. And that's really where doing things like stool testing comes into play. But while we tend to think of, well, let me ask you this, just kind of in your own mind, if I say to you, what does the gut do? What's your first thought? Chances are your first thought is, well, it's where I digest my food, which is certainly true. But your gut is far more than simply a digestive organ. It's not just where we make enzymes and break up our food and derive both macro and micronutrients from our diet. It is where we house about 70% or so of our gut-based immune system, or of the immune system, which is gut-based. And so I would encourage you to think of your GI system as having multiple dimensions or multiple aspects of function that span everything from digestive capacity to immunological function to hormone production of vitamins, minerals, neurotransmitters, and so on. It's really quite complicated. And if we go back to very old naturopathic principles, which tends to believe, and rightly so to a certain extent, that health begins in the gut, then it's very easy to understand why docs and other practitioners like me tend to do a lot of work with people's GI systems. And we tend to do a lot of stool testing. Not that we do stool testing on every person, although there's certainly doctors out there that do kind of like pre-planned programs, and they just do the same diagnostics on everyone, regardless of their presentation. Now, full transparency, do I do a lot of stool testing? Yes, I do. But that's because of the nature of the type of cases or the type of people that I work with, speaking about my one-on-one coaching practice. And so the reason why stool testing, and maybe I should preface it by saying good stool testing, makes it into my list of labs that I would spend my own money on. It's probably multiple reasons for that. One is because of the prevalence of GI-related complaints, and I'll come back to that in a second. But two, just because of the centrality of gut health, not just from a digestive capacity, functional capacity, but from this immunological aspect. And one might argue that the immune function of the gut is perhaps more important than the digestive function. Truly, you can't separate them because they're different parts of the same system. But if I have a client who maybe has some malabsorption and maybe poor digestive capacity, and they're not getting as much out of their food as they otherwise think they should, but they don't have any gut-based immune dysregulation, compared to someone who maybe digests things and draws nutrients out properly, but has a gut-based immune dysfunction, then the person with the gut-based immune dysfunction is always going to be less healthy than the person whose gut-based immune system is working well, even though the digestive capacity may be different. And that just is simply reality. I mean, just the immune system is a major communication system in between the brain, the hormones, and the immune system itself. And it's part of how we control and coordinate our major super systems. And again, I might refer you back to, it was probably the first or the second episode I did, where I talked about the neuroendocrine immune super system and how that controls all aspects of human function and human health and well-being. And the gut just happens to be a big player within the context of that. And so when you look at the human frame, it is a super system made up of systems which have subsystems, and they're all connected together. And this is one of the challenges that we're faced with in conventional healthcare, or any type of healthcare practitioner who is poorly trained in the integrated nature of the human body. And unfortunately, basic medical school, even my own background in terms of chiropractic school, even though we did have a generally integrated approach to learning anatomy and physiology, it certainly pales in comparison to what I've come to understand through my own study and professional training in the 25, almost 30 years since I've been in practice. Bottom line is this, is that docs in general tend to be poorly trained in how wellness works and how the human body works as an integrated whole. And once we get into practice, we have a tendency to develop certain ways of doing things, and we tend to do it that way all the time with everyone we see, just because it becomes easy for us. It's what we know. But every once in a while, you get someone who needs a different way of thinking, a different way of looking at health and wellness, and figuring out where you've lost your wellness and how to get that back. And the gut is quite often a player in that realm. Now, let me go back to something I said before about the prevalence of GI complaints in general population. And certainly, if I do just kind of a quick mental survey and just recall clients that I've worked with over the last decade or so, almost all of them have something going on in their gut that is part of their presenting complaints. But I will tell you that if you have the mindset that in order for you to do something like a good stool test or any type of GI testing, that you have to have GI complaints, the answer is really you don't. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is completely possible for you to have infections in your gut, or to have something, say, leaky gut, which we don't test that on a stool test. That's more of a tier 2 test, which we'll probably get to at some point. But let me rephrase it, or let me state some facts. The most common infectious disease in the world is a bacteria called H. pylori, Helicobacter pylori. At any given moment of time, about half of the world's population has H. pylori in their gut. In fact, at this point, we consider H. pylori to be a common, if not normal, inhabitant of healthy guts, but not unhealthy guts. I mean, quite often we have H. pylori present, but the issue is not necessarily whether H. pylori is there. It's whether or not our gut is healthy enough to keep control and containment of that, or if we have an overgrowth of H. pylori, particularly of a type of species that can produce any number of different toxins that H. pylori is capable of producing. But this is not a talk about H. pylori, even though it's a topic of interest because it's quite common. The bottom line is this, is that if we look at the statistics, there's a 50% chance that you have H. pylori in your gut. And if you have what we might consider an overgrowth, or let's call it an infection with H. pylori, 80% of the time, 80% of the time, you're going to be asymptomatic, meaning you're going to have this overgrowth or this infection, and you're not going to know about it. And that's a real problem, because in the short term, that might not be all that problematic. But in the long run, what we know with these long-running, chronic, silent H. pylori infections is that they have a very high degree of correlation to things like inflammatory bowel diseases, and even worse, things like gastric carcinoma or stomach cancer. And so just because an infection is silent or not creating symptoms doesn't mean you let it alone. And unfortunately, there's a large part of the conventional medical system right now, or a large contingent, that says, hey, if you have H. pylori but you don't have any symptoms, we're not going to treat it. Not that the medical treatment of this is very successful, because it's not. That's just, again, cold, hard facts. In fact, the medical treatment of H. pylori is typically a triple drug cocktail, where you have a couple of antibiotics and then a proton pump inhibitor to suppress the production of stomach acid. Quite often, people with H. pylori who are symptomatic have things like acid reflux as part of the problem. Again, another conversation perhaps for a different day, because I want to talk not just about H. pylori, but about gut health in general, and then stool testing. So back to this idea that you don't have to have gut symptoms to think it's worthwhile, or to conclude that it's worthwhile to do a stool test. And I wholeheartedly embrace that. Part of the reason, again, for that is that there are some infections that do alter your physiology and change what happens in your gut, but they do not produce symptoms, at least not symptoms that we would connect to, oh gosh, I've got an infection in my gut, I better get a stool test done. But the other part of this is that sometimes people are infected, whether it's H. pylori or any number of other bacteria or fungal species or parasitic species or gut viruses. There are a lot of people who have these issues who have learned over time to constrain their diet and lifestyle choices around their dysfunction to the point where their guts are asymptomatic, but they're still infected. And actually, probably the best way to illustrate this is like a client story. And this lady is perhaps one of the first people that I consulted with when I first started doing functional medicine. In fact, she was my daughter. I have one daughter. One of her friend's mothers started talking to me in the gym one day about some issues, and turns out that she had recently gone to Mayo Clinic with complaints of fatigue and pain and a whole bunch of other things. And basically at the end of their evaluation, she was told, hey, you've got fibromyalgia. We don't know what causes it. Nobody can help you. Go home and live your best life, which of course is not very helpful at all, particularly when that comes from what many deem to be some of the best doctors in the world, which I might disagree with that for many different reasons. But again, different topic for a different day. So anyways, we went through some basic evaluation. She filled out an intake form for me. We did some blood work. I believe we did a saliva test to check her adrenals. We found some things related to blood sugar and adrenals that could explain a lot of her fatigue. So we started working together, and after a period of about a few weeks, she was like no better. And I was crushed because I really wanted to help her. And this was one of my first clients. Now, granted, I was less seasoned than I am right now. I was less wise, less informed. So I would do things differently now than what I did back then. But nevertheless, I said, okay, we go back to the drawing board. And I started asking her about her gut and her diet. Yes, I understand I should have done that in the beginning. But again, I didn't know what I was doing, to be honest. I was doing my best and wanting to help people. But nevertheless, we started talking about her gut, and she said, well, I can only eat 5 things. And if I stray outside of that, then I get all these issues. And so we ended up doing a stool test, and turned out that she had multiple bacterial infections, a candida infection, which I don't find all the time, but she had one. And she had at least 1, if not 2 parasites. And it turned out she was gluten sensitive. And we put her on a gut protocol, put her on a gluten-free diet. And I kid you not, within 2 weeks, her fatigue and pain levels were, if I remember correctly, about 75, 80% better. And she had just been told by one of the best clinics in the world, and I'm using air quotes around that, that nobody knew what caused her issues and nobody could help her. Some simple strategies made some very profound differences. But here's the lesson. She had no gut complaints at all. When I go back and look at her records and look at her symptom survey, the section where we ask all these questions about what's going on in the gut, it was all blank. It was all zeros on a scale of like 0 to 10 or 0 to 3. And so what I learned, and it was a very important lesson for me, is that sometimes people report no symptoms because they've learned to not do things that they give them symptoms, that do give them symptoms, but it doesn't mean that there's not a problem there. And so I would encourage you, if you're thinking about yourself, and maybe you're just brushing it off and going, well, I don't need to do a stool test. My gut is fine. Maybe that's true. But maybe you have these stealth infections that can be there but produce no symptoms. Or maybe you have just learned consciously or unconsciously, subconsciously, better said, maybe you've just learned to work around it. And you've created a silent gut, a quiet gut, even though inside you have things that are contributing to maybe other complaints that you do have. And so the presence or the absence of gut symptomatology is not the best guide to determine whether or not you should or should not do stool testing. And if you do, and it comes back to be less than impressive, maybe you find nothing. Maybe you find a couple of things when you find you thought you were going to find a bunch of things. Maybe you thought you'd find a parasite, but you found a common bacteria. There's any number of different combinations and permutations of test results. But I guarantee you, and we'll probably save this conversation for the next episode, that if you do a stool test, and this is a note also for any healthcare practitioners who might be listening, because I do have a lot of doctors and other healthcare practitioners that listen on the podcast here. If you do a stool sample on somebody and you get a test report back and you're looking at what's printed on the paper, and let's just assume that you've chosen a reputable lab that uses good technology. That test represents the absolute best case scenario. And there's a high probability that things are actually worse than what the lab has been able to detect. And the reason for this is based on something called biofilm. And we're going to save that for another episode, just simply because I could probably talk for a few hours just on the topic of biofilm itself, which now is all over the research. But 15 years ago, when I first stumbled upon some of the rare articles that were published initially about the presence of biofilm and their role in chronic gut infections and gut health, hardly anybody knew about it. In fact, if I think back about 12 years, 15 years or so, when I first started dealing with biofilm in my own practice with my own clients, and I started sharing this in the seminars that I was teaching around the country. If I said, hey, who here has heard of biofilm? Nobody put up their hand. And in fact, I was just about a month and a half ago, I was in San Francisco teaching a seminar about 45 doctors. And we got to a section where we talked briefly about gut health. It was on a different topic, but nevertheless, we end up talking about gut health in different scenarios, in different contexts anyways. And I asked the same question. I said, who here has heard of biofilm? And more than half the class put up their hand. And that's a radical difference. And a lot of it is simply because we have more being published on it. Now, nutraceutical companies that make nutritional supplements are making formulas to deal with this. And it's a real deal. So we'll save that for the next episode. Let me just talk briefly about some of the testing technology and some of the changes that's happened, because there are many different companies out there that are happy to take your money and send you a report. Some technologies are a little bit more accurate than others. And there are some challenges in finding things that are in there. Like back in the early days, before we actually had the availability of things like DNA-based or PCR testing. You're probably familiar with PCR testing just because of what's been going on with coronavirus and coronavirus testing. But nevertheless, that kind of testing was not available for gut pathogens or commensal organisms up until, say, the last 15 years. It might have been a little bit before that, but nevertheless, up until a certain point, we didn't have it. All we had was a laboratory technician sitting in a lab looking at your stool sample in a microscope, hoping to find little wigglies that they recognize. And they would count the number of little wigglies that they found in a gram sample of your stool, and that would then translate into an infection of a certain magnitude. But now we have far more sensitive technology. We have companies, and there's only a couple of them, that are using DNA-based testing. And it's literally about 1,000 times more sensitive than the results of even a well-trained laboratory technician working in a microbiology lab. And so give me a DNA-based test that's run by a computer with very high sensitivity and specificity. Give me that over a lab tech any day, because what if you had you're doing it's called culture and microscopy. Let's say that you do a stool test and the doctor that you're working with chooses culture and microscopy, and you send your sample in, and maybe you get the Monday hungover lab tech, or maybe they're just having a bad day and they're not really paying attention to their work and their mind is somewhere else. And there's any number of things that can go wrong when a human is looking through a spyglass. But when you are detecting DNA fragments, far more accurate, far more sensitive. And so we can have a lot more confidence, in my opinion. And I've spoken to a couple of different microbiologists about this, and they agree with this statement, that it is far more accurate, far more sensitive and specific to look at DNA fragments that are recognized by computer algorithms, as opposed to a human looking through a microscope trying to identify the number of microorganisms in a very small sample of stool. And this is, one of the challenges, that there are a lot of companies that are out there that are still doing culture and microscopy or some version of that, because it's not that these are our only two options. There are other options of technology, things like MALDI-TOF, which is what I went to in between my phase when I started getting away from labs that did culture and microscopy to more sophisticated technology, until the PCR stuff started coming up. And so now, in my opinion, the labs that do the best job, and I'll name one, Diagnostic Solutions Lab is the one that I've been using almost exclusively for probably about 8 years or so now. And I have no financial connection to them. I just think that they do a good job, and I like the information that they give me as a clinician. It's very helpful for me in putting together personalized GI programs or protocols for people. But nevertheless, the DNA PCR-based testing, which is relatively new in the history of microbiology, not new in the sense of last year, but talking about the last decade or two, the DNA testing, I believe, has revolutionized the testing field and the testing world, and it allows us to check for things and get results that are accurate, reliable, reproducible, and repeatable. So we can trust them, which is why I like to use labs that are at the cutting edge of technology. Now, having said all that, here's another challenge that I think the PCR testing tends to get around, and that is testing for parasites. In fact, and I'll tell you something that I've taught for years in my functional medicine seminars when we talk about GI health, is that when you're using non-DNA based testing to look for parasites, the recommendation is that you actually test 3 different stool samples that are collected on 3 different days. And to make matters worse, and the reason for that is because parasites have a 30-day life cycle where they go into an egg form and then they hatch and become an adult. And so if you do a single stool sample, you might find a handful of, let's call them adults, that show up in your stool. Well, there's probably a whole bunch of babies in egg form that haven't hatched yet. And 30 days later, you get a whole new crop, if you will, of parasites coming out into the gut, which is, kind of a little bit weird to think about or to talk about, but that's the reality. But what the literature said is and I've read several papers on this. It's been a while since I did this kind of a literature review, but I did find several papers that talked about some of the challenges in parasitology. And one of them was, hey, start with a single sample is only going to catch a low percentage of the total load in someone's gut. That's why they recommend doing 3 samples on 3 different days. But one paper went further and said, hey, if you don't find a parasite in the first 3 samples, do another 3. But who on earth, who in the right mind, is going to tell their client, I need you to give me 6 different stool samples on 6 different days, and even then we might not find what we're looking for, even though it's really there. This is one of the reasons why I do prefer the PCR testing, because it doesn't matter if we're dealing with parasites in the adult form or if they're in eggs and they're incubating, the DNA fragments will be there, and the protocols and the algorithms can pick them up. And so we can get away with getting a ton of accurate and reliable information just by going with a single sample collection, which is a lot easier for my clients to collect at home. And it's just easier and it's more accurate. So win-win. All right, so I'm going to leave it there for right now, and join me again in the next episode. We'll finish this off talking about stool testing. We'll talk a little bit about biofilm, what it is, why it's important to understand it, whether or not we can test for it, and we'll probably sprinkle in a little bit of discussion about leaky gut as well. And I have a sneaking suspicion this is just going to turn into a series on the gut, so I may as well just say it now. That's probably where we're going after this series is complete. Hey, as always, thanks for hanging out with me. Dr. Rand, out.